What does a legend wish for? Not fortune, not fame, not even more time. Sometimes all a legend really wants is to be remembered the right way. Just weeks before his final breath, the world lost not just a musician, but a force of nature. Ozzy Osbourne, the howling heart of rock and roll, the man who birthed a genre and set it ablaze, was gone. At 76, he left behind more than music. He left behind a myth, a story too wild to believe and too human to ignore. But even as the world mourned, behind closed doors, something far more personal was unfolding. Because Ozzy wasn't fading like most. He wasn't drifting into the night quietly. Even as his body gave in, his mind, his fire, refused to be extinguished. He was never just a rock star. He was a storm in black leather, a prophet in eyeliner, a rebel poet who screamed louder than his pain. And as death loomed, it wasn't peace he asked for. It was one last roar. Not for himself, for those who had followed his voice through decades of madness, recovery, rage, and redemption. For those who had screamed his lyrics in the dark when nothing else made sense. For the outcasts, for the broken, for the believers. That final wish wasn't whispered to a crowd or posted on a screen. It was spoken in hushed tones, just once, to the only person who had ever truly known the man beneath the madness. To Sharon, his wife, his warrior, his witness. And when she heard it, she didn't ask why. Because she already knew. Ozzy didn't want to be remembered in a hospital bed. He wanted to be remembered in sound, in sweat, in fire. In a moment that would shake the earth one final time. The house was silent. Not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that feels like it's holding its breath. Outside, summer brushed gently against the curtains, rustling them like the final notes of a fading song. The sun came and went. The birds still chirped. But inside the Osbourne estate, it was as if the world had been paused. Time no longer moved in seconds. It moved in sighs, in heartbeats, in the slow, almost sacred rhythm of waiting. And there, in the center of it all, was Sharon. Every day, she sat beside Ozzy's bed, not out of duty, but out of love. A love too deep to be spoken, one forged through fire, scandal, loss, and more than anything, endurance. Her hand rested gently in his, fingers intertwined like the notes of a song only they knew how to play. The man beside her no longer looked like the Prince of Darkness. The black leather had been traded for hospital gowns, the thunderous voice now a rasp. But the presence, it hadn't left. It lingered in the way his eyes still searched the ceiling, as if watching old memories flicker like concert lights. It whispered through his faint smiles when the pain momentarily let him rest. It lived in the space between their silences. Ozzy wasn't dying in chaos. He wasn't leaving this world as the wild storm he once was. He was leaving in stillness, and yet somehow that stillness was louder than any scream. It was the stillness before something enormous. The kind of stillness you feel before the lights go out in an arena, before the first note strikes, before history is made. Because even in the silence, Ozzy's story wasn't over. It was building toward one final crescendo. Parkinson's doesn't arrive like thunder. It comes like a whisper, a flicker in the hand, a hesitation in the foot, a pause in the breath, and then it grows quietly, cruelly, until it becomes something unignorable. For Ozzy, it was a thief in the night, one that crept into his body and began to steal, piece by piece, what the world once saw as immortal. The man who had once leapt across stages like a possessed preacher, sweat-soaked, electrified, untamed, could now barely sit up in bed without help. His limbs, once extensions of his soul, now betrayed him. Muscles refused to obey. His own body had become foreign. The disease didn't just attack his movement, it attacked his identity. Parkinson's stripped him of the swagger, the gestures, the wild physicality that made him Ozzy. But what it could never touch, what it dared not touch, was the fire behind his eyes. Because every time Sharon walked into the room, that fire flickered. Even when his hands trembled too violently to hold a spoon, even when breathing left him winded, Even when the world assumed he was drifting away, Ozzy's spirit kept humming beneath the surface like feedback from a forgotten amplifier, still buzzing with energy, still alive with mischief. In a rare moment of honesty, he whispered to Sharon, "The past 4 years have been sheer hell." There was no self-pity in his voice, only truth. And yet somehow he always ended with a grin, a defiant, crooked warrior's grin. "This body's broken," he said one morning, barely able to lift his tea, but the brain's still partying. It wasn't a joke. It was a declaration. Ozzy Osbourne, rock's loudest rebel, was still in there, still thinking, still feeling, still burning. And that spark would be the beginning of something no one saw coming. Every morning, without fail, Ozzy asked for the same 2 things: a cup of tea and Sharon. Not doctors, not painkillers, just her. And a simple ritual that made him feel, if only for a moment, like himself again. They would sit together, hour after hour, no schedules, no pressure. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes they just listened to the wind against the windows or the distant hum of birdsong, as if even the earth was afraid to disturb them. But in those quiet moments, Ozzy's mind wandered far. It wasn't confusion, it was memory. He drifted not out of reality, but through time. He spoke with surprising clarity, like his body had given up, but his mind had been set free. He remembered the bitter winters of Aston, where he'd grown up poor, cold, and hungry. He could still feel the soot on the streets, still hear the clang of factories in his ears, still see the looks on his parents' faces when money ran out before the week did. And then, a glimmer in his voice, he laughed, actually laughed, when he recalled his first gig. Terrified, completely under-rehearsed, he said, eyes twinkling. "But when I stepped onto that stage, it was like plugging into something electric, like being struck by lightning and surviving it." His memories weren't polished or romantic, they were raw, real, sacred. He spoke of Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, Bill Ward, his brothers in darkness, the ones who helped him unleash a genre the world didn't know it needed. He called them the storm, and himself, the howl in the middle of it. But the past wasn't always joyful. His voice trembled when he spoke of his children: Kelly, fierce and fearless; Jack, steady and loyal; Amy, the quiet strength in the family. Even the grandkids brought tears to his eyes, tears he could no longer wipe away on his own. And then came a whisper, so faint Sharon had to lean in. "Promise me they'll remember the fire, not the flicker." That was Ozzy's fear, that Parkinson's would reduce his legacy to weakness, that the world would forget the man who once defied gravity and only see the one fading in a chair. But Sharon understood. She always had, because even in that fragile body, she still saw the fire, still felt it burning beneath the skin, and she knew what had to be done. The days bled into each other like ink in water, slow, silent, irreversible. But inside Ozzy's mind, time wasn't linear. It danced, it looped, it pulsed to the rhythm of old guitar riffs, street fights, and cigarette smoke. Some memories were sharp like shattered glass. Others came wrapped in the hazy glow of nostalgia. He spoke of Aston often, the broken sidewalks, the bone-deep cold, the smell of factory soot on his father's coat, the feeling of being invisible, just another poor kid with a funny voice and a future that seemed already written in grey. Ozzy had never romanticized his childhood. It had been hard, it had been bleak, but it had been real. And somehow he found beauty in that rawness. He remembered the hunger, not just for food, but for something more. Something that could lift him off the ground, even if only for 3 minutes at a time. And then came 1968. He didn't just recall it, he relived it. His voice lit up when he talked about the moment Black Sabbath formed, Tony's damaged fingers and sinister riffs, Geezer's dark poetic lyrics, Bill's unrelenting heartbeat behind the kit, and Ozzy, well, Ozzy was the chaos they didn't know they needed. He described their first record like it was a living thing. It didn't sound like anything else, because we weren't trying to sound like anything else, he said. We just played the truth, no matter how ugly it sounded. Gee. And that truth? It caught fire. He remembered fans crying in the front row, not because they were happy, but because someone was finally screaming the pain they had no words for. Songs like Paranoid and War Pigs weren't just music. They were lifelines, battle cries, revolts. And Ozzy? He wasn't a singer. He was a conduit, a lightning rod. But for all the triumph, his voice always slowed when he spoke of the demons, the substance abuse, the breakdowns, the moments he didn't think he'd survive. And yet, even in the middle of that chaos, there was always Sharon. He didn't say it often. He didn't need to. But when his memories landed on her, his tone changed, softened, like a man no longer reliving a story, but returning home. If Ozzy's legacy was born on the stage, it was kept alive at the kitchen table. And when he spoke of his family, the rock star disappeared. What remained was a father, a husband, a grandfather, fragile, grateful, and impossibly human. His voice would tremble when he said Kelly's name, not because of sadness, but because of pride. "She's got my fire," he said once, barely above a whisper. But Sharon's control, that's a dangerous combo. His eyes gleamed with mischief, the way only a father's eyes can. Jack, he described differently. That boy's a rock, always has been. He remembered Jack's steadiness during his darkest hours, how he never looked away, how he never gave up on his dad, even when Ozzy didn't recognize himself in the mirror. Amy was quieter, a different rhythm in a noisy household. But Ozzy spoke of her with a kind of reverence. "She's strong in silence," he said. "That's a strength I never had." Lay. And then came the grandchildren. Oh, how his eyes lit up at their names. He didn't speak of them in stories, he spoke of them in hopes, as if the world might be crueler than he could bear, but that they might grow up inside the songs he left behind. "They'll never know the stage like I did," he said softly, "but maybe they'll know the fire, that part of me that kept going when everything else gave out." Ollie, he turned to Sharon one night, body fragile, voice almost gone, and said, "Promise me they won't remember the man in the chair, they'll remember the thunder." And Sharon couldn't speak. She bit her lip, tears stinging at the edges of her eyes. Because how do you answer a request like that? How do you promise to preserve a legacy when the man behind it is slipping away before your eyes? She had watched him burn himself down and rebuild again over and over, like some beautiful broken phoenix. She had survived the chaos, the collapse, the near deaths, and the true ones. But never before had she seen him like this. So diminished, and yet somehow more alive than ever. The body was surrendering, but the man was still roaring, and she knew this couldn't be the end. Not like this. There was no dramatic music, no epiphany under spotlight, just a simple evening, late June, when the air was warm and heavy with dusk, and the sky outside their window glowed orange like the last embers of a dying fire. Ozzy sat quietly, his breathing shallow but steady. Sharon, as always, was beside him, her hand in his like it had been for decades, through addiction, through rehab, through triumph and collapse, through everything. He hadn't spoken in a while. The day had been harder than most. His energy had faded early, and Sharon feared he might slip into one of those long, quiet spells that never truly ended. But then, without warning, he turned his head. His eyes, clouded but clear, found hers. And he said something she would never forget. "I don't want them to remember a man in a wheelchair." His voice was thin, but his meaning was thunder. "I don't want to be their sadness. I want to give them one last roar, where it all began." Or, it wasn't a request, it was a commandment, a vow. A final rebellion from the man who had spent his life fighting back against everything expectations, death himself. Sharon didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, not because she knew how, but because she knew she had to. This wasn't about a concert anymore. This was about giving Ozzy his storybook, ending not in fantasy, but in full, furious, unapologetic truth. She stood, kissed his forehead, and walked out of the room. Her eyes didn't water. Her hands didn't shake. But deep inside, she knew. She had just accepted the hardest mission of her life, and there would be no second chance. Sharon didn't sleep that night. While Ozzy dozed in fractured dreams, tangled in machines and memories, she sat by the window, staring out at the blackened horizon, heart-pounding, mind-racing. By dawn, she was already on the phone. Not dramatic calls, not headlines, not press conferences. Whispers. Private, cautious whispers to the few who might understand what she was trying to do. Because Sharon knew this wasn't just about fulfilling a dying wish. This was about giving Ozzy something the world had nearly taken from him, his dignity. He wasn't a patient. He was a performer, and she wasn't going to let the end come quietly. She made lists, tour crews, stage managers, sound engineers. She reached out to people who had once built empires with them, people who hadn't heard from her in years. Some cried when they picked up the phone. Others were stunned into silence. And yet, not one person said no. Not because they believed it would work, but because they believed in Ozzy. Sharon told no one else. Not Jack, not Kelly, not even Amy. She held the idea like a secret flame cupped between her hands, shielding it from the world's wind, from its logic, from its cruelty. Because if anyone tried to talk her out of it, she might break. So she kept moving, one quiet step at a time. Like a general planning an impossible rescue mission, only her battlefield wasn't a war zone. It was a stage, and at the center of it, a man who could barely stand but still knew how to ignite the sky. No one told Sharon it would be easy. From the very first phone calls, she ran into resistance, cold, clinical, relentless. Ozzy's doctors warned her in blunt terms, he won't survive this. The medical team threw up red flags at every turn. Travel? Impossible. Stage lights? Too intense. Loud sound? Could trigger a seizure. Even one performance, they said, might kill him. Friends, even the closest ones, looked at her with concern. Not admiration, not respect, pity. They didn't see a wife carrying out a vow. They saw a desperate woman clinging to something that was already gone. Even Ozzy, in his darkest moment, begged her to let it go. "I'm done, Sharon," he whispered one night, his voice brittle as glass. "Don't make me a fool." But she didn't blink. Not out of denial, out of conviction. Because Sharon knew something that everyone else seemed to forget. Ozzy never dropped the mic mid-song. She didn't fight back with arguments. She didn't plead or beg. She simply looked at him, eyes steady, and said the words he had once said to the world, "You're not done. Not until the music stops." This wasn't about prolonging his life. She wasn't chasing miracles. She was chasing meaning. She was fighting for the kind of ending Ozzy deserved. Not one spent in sterile beds and hospital gowns, but under the lights, with the roar of a crowd, with the beat of drums echoing like a heartbeat. If the world thought she was crazy, then the world didn't understand love. Because Sharon wasn't holding on to hope. She was holding on to truth, and the truth was simple. Inside that failing body was still Ozzy, still thunder, still flame, still the sound that made the whole world listen. Behind closed doors, Sharon became a one-woman army. She didn't have time for doubt, or fear, or sleep. Every hour mattered, every detail counted, and every second brought Ozzy closer to a goodbye she refused to let be ordinary. She worked in shadows, emailing producers in the dead of night, bargaining with tour managers who hadn't taken her calls in years. She called in favors that had been buried under decades of silence. She contacted medical specialists in London, Los Angeles, Tokyo, anyone who might give her a sliver of yes in a sea of no. She wasn't just planning a show, she was building a resurrection. She reassembled the old crew. Lighting techs who knew how to drench the stage in shadow and fire. Sound engineers who remembered how Ozzy's mic had to be tuned to his breath, not just his pitch. Roadies who had seen it all and were willing to do it again, one last time. She picked the venue with precision. Villa Park, Birmingham. Not Madison Square Garden, not LA, not Wembley. Home, where the story began. Every piece was calculated. Every second of the night designed to bring Ozzy back to himself, if only for a few moments. She scripted the set list like a farewell letter. She reviewed every lighting cue, every pyro burst, every camera angle. She didn't just want people to watch. She wanted them to feel this wasn't just a concert, it was a reckoning, and no one, not even fate, was going to stop it. In the quiet hours when Ozzy was too tired to speak, she sat by his side, earbuds in, listening to demos from 1980, tour tapes from 92, live mixes from South America, searching for the right sounds, the right energy, the perfect goodbye. And when he could speak, they rehearsed softly, gently, line by line, verse by verse, his hands trembling, his lungs straining. But Sharon never looked away. She only whispered, "They're not ready, and neither are you." Because deep down, she believed one thing. When the lights went up, Ozzy wouldn't just perform, he would rise. The doctors didn't back down. Their voices grew sharper, more urgent. "This is a risk we cannot support," one of them said bluntly. "If he walks out on that stage, it might be the last thing he ever does." Sharon nodded. She understood the stakes, but she also understood something far deeper, something the charts and scans and statistics could never capture. Ozzy wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of disappearing. And there's a difference. Death to a man like Ozzy was never the enemy. He had danced with it for decades through overdoses, collapses, near-death spirals. What haunted him wasn't the end. It was an ending without sound. No fire, no scream, no goodbye. And Sharon knew in her bones, if Ozzy was going to leave this world, he deserved to do it the only way he ever knew how. Loud, defiant, legendary. So she pushed forward. She negotiated with cold administrators and terrified medical staff. She demanded custom-built backstage recovery rooms, hired a full private emergency team to be on site, coordinated oxygen setups, exit routes, quiet spaces. Every what-if was countered with a plan. Every doubt was buried under conviction. And still, she never told the children. Not yet. Because it wasn't time for grief. It was time for mission execution. There were nights when Ozzy's strength failed completely, when even sitting upright felt like climbing Everest. When Sharon had to hold a microphone in his hand and steady his wrist just so he could hum a single line. He would look at her then, broken, shaking, scared, and she would whisper, "Let the world hear your goodbye." And he would try again, because in the deepest corners of their hearts, they both knew this wasn't just a show. It was his final choice, not to be remembered as the man fading in silence, but as the legend who gave every last drop to the stage, even if it cost him everything. The 5th of July, 2025. The streets of Birmingham trembled not from traffic, but from something deeper, something electric in the air. Fans began arriving before sunrise, some in worn leather jackets from 1983, others in shirts freshly printed with Ozzy's face and the words, "One last time." They didn't know it yet. Not really. They thought they were here for a celebration. But Sharon knew. She had picked Villa Park with the precision of a farewell poem. This wasn't just a stadium, it was a sacred ground. This was where Ozzy's story had begun, long before the fame, the madness, the mythology. Just a poor kid from Aston, Birmingham, with nothing to lose and everything to scream. Now, 40,000 people stood where his ashes of childhood once lived, waiting, cheering, chanting, unaware that they were not just fans tonight. They were witnesses. Inside the arena, everything was perfect. Not glamorous, not overdone, precise. Sharon had designed the stage layout herself. Every screen, every shadow, every inch of the lighting grid was positioned not for spectacle, but for reverence. The crew, old and new, moved like clockwork. Techs ran cables with shaking hands. Sound guys triple-checked everything. Firework crews held their breath because they all knew, whether they admitted it or not, this wasn't just a show. This was the last chapter of a legend. Outside, the crowd was swelling. Teenagers who had only heard his music through their parents' vinyls, old men with canes and Ozzy tattoos faded by time, parents with kids on their shoulders. entire generations unified by one thing, that voice. And as the sun dipped beneath the skyline, casting the stadium in a golden glow, Sharon stood alone backstage. She looked toward the entrance Ozzy would soon be wheeled through, and whispered to herself, "This is it. No one thought it would happen. Not in this lifetime." But Sharon made it happen anyway. Because if Ozzy was going to take one final breath on stage, she was going to make sure he wasn't alone. She wasn't content with just one tribute act or a standard farewell lineup. She wanted the family back together, the origin, the storm. And so, for the first time in more than 2 decades, she brought the impossible into reality. Black Sabbath together again. Tony Iommi, the riffmaster whose guitar licks defined an entire genre. Geezer Butler, whose dark poetry had given Sabbath its soul. And Bill Ward, the heartbeat the thunder who hadn't shared a stage with Ozzy in decades. They weren't just a band, they were the men who had stood beside him when it all began. The architects of the chaos, the brothers of the scream. And now they were back. One last time, there was no press release, no media leak. Sharon wanted the moment to hit like lightning, unannounced, unforgettable. She handled every detail, down to the instruments, the wardrobe, the set list. She had each of their gear shipped, tuned, positioned on stage quietly. No sound checks during the day, no rehearsal on the main stage. Everything happened in sealed rooms under heavy security. Because she knew this wasn't about spectacle, it was about meaning, it was about completion. And when the fans saw them, Tony, Geezer, Bill standing under the same lights again, flanking Ozzy like the 4 horsemen of a musical apocalypse, they didn't cheer. They wept. Because in that instant, it wasn't just Ozzy saying goodbye. It was Black Sabbath closing the circle. The storm had returned, not to destroy, but to honor its own. Sharon wasn't finished. The reunion of Black Sabbath alone would have made history. But this wasn't just about legacy, it was about lineage. And so she made the calls. Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Judas Priest, Anthrax. These weren't just guests. They were disciples bands that had been shaped, shaken, and set on fire by Ozzy's trailblazing madness. Every one of them owed their existence in part to a man who once screamed his truth into a microphone before the world was ready to hear it. And they all said yes. Not for publicity, not for money, but because when the Godfather calls, you answer. They cleared schedules, flew across oceans, rearranged entire tours, not to perform with Ozzy, but to stand behind him, shoulder to shoulder, as part of the final roar. Sharon arranged it like a symphony. Each band would take a song not their own, but Ozzy's. Not just to play it, but to interpret it, to honor it, to become part of a living requiem composed of distortion, reverence, and fury. It wasn't a concert anymore. It was a cathedral of guitars, a full-force spiritual experience where every riff became a prayer and every lyric a eulogy. Rehearsals were secret. No social media, no leaks, just private sessions in dark warehouses and hotel rooms where grown men who had played to millions now trembled at the thought of playing for one man. One man in a black steel throne, one man who had taught them that vulnerability could be loud, that pain could be melodic, that rebellion could save your life. On the 5th of July, when they stepped onto that stage backlit by fire, swallowed in smoke, they weren't rock gods. They were sons returning to thank the Father. Ozzy didn't ask for a tribute. He became the tribute. The crowd had been chanting for an hour. Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy. The lights dimmed, then vanished. An eerie silence fell over Villa Park, not emptiness, but anticipation so thick it felt like the entire stadium had stopped breathing. And then movement, slow, deliberate, powerful. Out of the shadows rolled a black steel throne, its edges glinting like obsidian under faint stage lights. Atop it, draped in dark velvet, crowned not with gold but with pain, fire, and history, sat Ozzy Osbourne. He wasn't walking. He wasn't standing. He didn't have to. He sat like a king, returning to his kingdom, not weak, not diminished, but undeniable. The stadium erupted. Tears, screams, hands thrown into the air, Some fans dropped to their knees. Others held each other, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. This wasn't a man being wheeled onto a stage. This was a resurrection. Sharon stood hidden behind the curtain, one hand over her mouth, the other gripping the wall to steady herself. She had seen Ozzy in every form, drunk, broken, triumphant, lost, but never like this. Never so still, so powerful, so alive. His eyes scanned the crowd slowly, like a prophet absorbing the energy of 1,000 prayers. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He simply nodded once, and the message was clear. I'm still here. Then a mic was placed in his hand. It trembled, but only for a second, and when he lifted it to his lips, the silence shattered. No introduction, no speech, just the music. The opening chords of Mama, I'm Coming Home, rang out like the sound of a soul returning to its source. It wasn't perfect. His voice cracked. His breath faltered, but none of it mattered, because every note carried something more powerful than pictured truth, the kind of truth that can only come from a man who had lived 1,000 lives and finally found peace in the final one. The kind of truth that silences critics and breaks hearts. 40,000 people sang with him, many crying, many shaking, most unable to look away. This wasn't just a song anymore. It was a farewell letter. And then silence again. The lights shifted. Red, white, lightning blue. A guitar pierced through the still air, sharp, familiar, and unstoppable. The first riff of Crazy Train. And the stadium exploded, like electricity had just struck the ground beneath their feet. Ozzy's head tilted back. His eyes flashed. His smile, small but defiant, said it all. I'm not done yet. His hands gripped the mic tighter, as if holding onto life itself. He sang it not as a throwback, but as a statement. A statement that even as the body failed, the spirit could still burn. The chorus hit like a tidal wave. The crowd wasn't singing, they were screaming. Old fans, young fans, generations united by a man who had once taken chaos and bent it into music that made you feel invincible. He didn't speak between the songs. No monologue, no goodbye, because he had already said everything he needed to say. Every lyric was a page from his book. Every note was a heartbeat. And when the last chord faded and the fireworks tore across the sky, not in celebration, but in salute, Ozzy didn't wave. He just closed his eyes for a moment and smiled, as if to say, now I'm ready. There was no encore, no second act, no sudden surprise waiting in the wings, just the aftershock of what had happened, what everyone now realized they had witnessed. People didn't rush to the exits. They stood in place, as if leaving would break the spell, as if moving too quickly might erase the memory of that final smile, that final note, that final flicker of fire from a man who had built his life on flame. Backstage, Sharon stood frozen. Her hands trembled, not from fear, not from exhaustion, but from relief. The kind that only comes after months of silent war, after fighting death, not to delay it, but to define it. She didn't run to Ozzy. She waited, watched, let him have this moment uninterrupted. When the steel throne rolled off stage, the crowd began to chant again, but this time it wasn't chaotic. It was sacred, like a hymn echoing through a broken cathedral. Ozzy, Ozzy, Ozzy. He didn't say goodbye to them. He didn't have to, because he had just done what no one believed he could, what even he hadn't believed he could. He had reclaimed himself, not as a patient, not as a fading icon, but as Ozzy Osbourne, one final time, and the silence that followed, it wasn't emptiness, it was awe, a collective heartbeat, a shared breath, the sound of 40,000 people, realizing they'd just seen the last great storm, and stood in its reign. 17 days later, the 22nd of July, 2025, the storm ended. There was no curtain call, no cameras, no guitars, just a quiet room tucked deep inside the Osbourne estate. The same room where months earlier, Ozzy had whispered his final wish. The same room where Sharon had first held his trembling hand and made a silent vow. Now, she held it again, But this time, he wasn't squeezing back. There were no dramatic final words, no poetic last lines. Ozzy had never been a man of scripted endings. He had already said what he needed to say on stage, in song, in silence. Sharon sat by his side, her fingers curled gently around his, like she had done through every collapse, every rehab, every sleepless night. She didn't sob, not at first. Her grief was too full, too deep, too sacred for sound. Jack, Kelly, and Amy stood nearby. No one moved, no one dared to break the moment. The man who had once been too loud for this world was now resting in a quiet so complete it felt almost holy. No machines beeped, no monitors flashed, just stillness. Ozzy's chest rose one final time and didn't fall again. And somehow, everyone in that room knew the world would never feel quite the same. Later, Sharon would say, "He looked at me one last time. He didn't need to speak. I saw it in his eyes. He was ready." But the world wasn't. Because how do you prepare to lose a man who had once convinced the whole planet that chaos could be beautiful? How do you say goodbye to a voice that made you feel like maybe you weren't so alone after all? You don't. You just freeze. Just like the air in that room, still, heavy, eternal. The news broke before sunrise. A single post, one sentence, no fanfare, no embellishment. Ozzy Osbourne has passed away peacefully at home, and within minutes, the world froze. From Tokyo to Toronto, São Paulo to Sydney, it felt like the earth paused mid-spin. Radios went silent. News anchors stumbled through their scripts. Social media erupted not with outrage, not with gossip, but with a wave of heartbreak that felt global. Number "Thank You Ozzy" trended in over 60 countries within an hour. But it wasn't just a hashtag. It was a collective sob, a final chorus sung by millions. Fans shared grainy concert photos from the 70-second, shaky videos from the 2000-second, voice memos of them trying to sing "Crazy Train" through their tears. Others posted nothing, just a black square with one word beneath it: thunder. People lit candles on sidewalks, in bedrooms, in front of arenas. They played his albums at full blast, not to celebrate his death, but to refuse silence. Because Ozzy wasn't just gone. He had left a space too loud to fill. Elton John was among the first to react, posting an old backstage photo, both men in eyeliner and leather. A rebel poet, a brother. The world feels colder today. Rod Stewart called him the loudest soul with the kindest heart. Paul McCartney wrote, "Legends don't die, they echo." And Tony Iommi, Ozzy's brother in noise and silence, shared a photo from their last rehearsal together. No caption, just a broken heart emoji. Because what could he possibly say? This wasn't just the end of a life. It was the closing of an era. The man who had outlived predictions, defied death, rewritten rules, and screamed louder than his demons, had finally gone quiet. And the world, somehow, couldn't breathe without him. The grief didn't come in waves. It came in tsunamis. Within hours, the tributes began not just from fans or musicians, but from entire cities, from nations, from cultures that had once feared his voice and now mourned its silence. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame released a full-length tribute video, a roaring montage of Ozzy's rise from the soot-covered streets of Birmingham to the screaming stages of Los Angeles and Tokyo. BBC Radio interrupted its regular programming to run a 10-hour marathon of his greatest hits, interspersed with archival interviews, fan messages, and backstage tapes no one had heard before. In London, Ozzy's silhouette was projected in candlelight across Tower Bridge. In Birmingham, the Symphony Hall lit up with the words, "Thank you, Ozzy, always." Shh! Across the ocean, Times Square paused its chaos to honor the chaos maker himself, a massive screen-looped concert footage with no sound, only subtitles of his most iconic lyrics. People stopped mid-commute. Some cried, some bowed their heads. In São Paulo, a choir of 1,000 fans sang, "Mama, I'm coming home," in Portuguese, each line trembling with raw, imperfect love. Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles was shut down as thousands poured into the street, candles in one hand, beer cans in the other, creating an impromptu vigil that felt like both a funeral and a festival. And in Tokyo, his name lit up the entire skyline above Shibuya Crossing, while speakers played the haunting intro of Mr. Crowley to stunned crowds who stood in complete silence. But perhaps the most staggering tribute came not from the famous, but from the forgotten. In war-torn cities, in underground bunkers, in prisons, in rehab centers, in places where hope is scarce and music is survival, Ozzy's voice still played. On phones with cracked screens, on smuggled cassette decks, on radios that only had one working channel, because his music wasn't just entertainment. It had become a lifeline, a weapon, a hug, a howl of understanding in a world that too often refused to listen. And now, as the world reeled from the loss, it became painfully clear. Ozzy didn't just shape a genre, he shaped the souls of those who had no other way to scream. 3 days after Ozzy's passing, the cameras returned, but not for a concert, not for chaos, not for spectacle. This time, they came for Sharon. She sat beneath a soft light, wearing black, her eyes ringed with exhaustion and years of tears she had never let fall in public. In her hands, she held a small velvet pouch. Inside was Ozzy's wedding ring, the one he had slipped on her finger over 4 decades ago, back when they were young, defiant, and completely unprepared for the storms that would come. She didn't begin with a statement. She didn't even say his name right away. She just looked into the camera and breathed. Then, in a voice that cracked but never collapsed, she whispered, "He didn't just want to live forever. He wanted to matter forever." She paused, long enough for the silence to wrap around her words. "And he does." "Ah?" The interviewer tried to ask another question, but Sharon held up her hand. There was more she needed to say. Ozzy gave everything, even when he had nothing left to give. His body was broken, his mind was tired, but his soul, it stayed on fire until the end. And now, I ask only one thing from the world he gave so much to. She held up the ring. Don't mourn him in silence, play him loud, let him echo, let your walls shake, let your heart break, let your memories scream, because that's how he'd want to be remembered. Not with flowers, with fire, and that was it. No long goodbye, no scripted tribute, just truth. Raw, unfiltered, irreplaceable. In that moment, millions of hearts broke and somehow healed at the same time. Because Sharon wasn't just speaking for herself, she was speaking for all of us who had ever clung to a song when life got too loud or too quiet. For anyone who had ever whispered, "Thank you" to a voice in the dark. Ozzy's story wasn't ending. It was becoming eternal. Ozzy may have left this world, but the silence never came. Instead, the music grew louder, raw, deeper. It became the farewell the world didn't know it needed, an anthem echoing from every corner of the planet. Within days of the heartbreaking news, tributes erupted spontaneously. No press releases, no organizers, just pure human instinct. In Los Angeles, thousands flooded Sunset Boulevard, not with cameras, but with candles. T-shirts from his 1981 tour, original vinyls, handmade posters, all came out like offerings at a sacred altar. The crowd swayed in unison, belting out "No More Tears" through choked voices and wet eyes. In New York, Times Square beamed his face across the city skyline. The words, "Thank you, Ozzy. You didn't leave, you became legend," flashed across the massive screen, holding traffic and time still. In Tokyo, Shibuya Crossing transformed into a shrine. Digital billboards played a loop of Ozzy's most iconic moments, microphone raised, eyes closed, lost in sound. Strangers bowed in silence beneath the glow. In São Paulo, over 1,000 voices formed a choir under the stars, singing "Mama, I'm Coming Home" in Portuguese. It wasn't just a song, it was a global heartbeat. And from the unlikeliest of places, the Vatican issued a rare public statement. Though the methods were unorthodox, his passion moved the soul of humanity. The world stood still. But Sharon did not. She didn't take to stages or cameras. She worked in the shadows, preparing the one thing Ozzy still asked for. Let them feel me. Let them hear me. One last time. She began quietly, meticulously, arranging what would soon be the largest global rock memorial ever conceived. Not a funeral, a thank you. Not for Ozzy the legend, but for Ozzy, the man who gave his last breath to music and to the millions who found salvation in his scream. Because Ozzy Osbourne's death wasn't the end. It was the final verse of a thunderous song that never really stopped playing. If Ozzy's music ever helped you survive, scream louder. Share his story. Pass it on. Let the next generation know he didn't fade away. He became eternal. Rest in power, Ozzy. Long live the Prince of Darkness.